Hi everyone, and welcome to week 4 of our organizational behavior course. Today, or this week, we're going to talk about our final content area before your first exam, which does mean that your first exam is coming up next week. So just to give you an idea of what to expect next week, hopefully everyone's read the syllabus and feels very confident about what's coming, but just to recap, your exam will become available first thing Monday morning. You will have until Friday at 5 p.m. to submit it. That means that you have to have entered into the exam and finalized the questions by 5 p.m. So it's not enough to start the exam by 5 p.m. It has to be totally finished by 5 p.m. Your exam will give you 2 hours to complete the questions once you've entered into it, but you have to do the 2 hours continuously. The way that Canvas works for these sorts of things is if you X out of the browser or close your computer, it's going to automatically submit the exam midway through. So you do have to have a full 2-hour block set aside so that you can complete the exam should you need the full time. The exam will consist of 4 short answer questions. You will be asked to select 3 of those short answer questions to respond to for 10 points each. And then you can also choose to respond to the 4th question for up to 5 extra credit points, just to build in some extra sort of padding in there for you. So you don't have to answer that 4th question, but if you want to, there's some points on the table. All right. So now that we hopefully have a good idea of what to expect next week, and there are certainly lots of instructions in Canvas that should make it nice and clear for you, I want to dive into our content for this week, which is individual differences. And here we're sort of positioning past just the outcomes that organizations care about. We've talked about job attitudes, we've talked about job behaviors as these key outcomes that organizations want to monitor and also invest in cultivating. And now we're focusing more on what predicts those outcomes. And we're going to start off by talking about individual differences, or what we bring to the table as people. So to formalize our agenda for our time together this week, we're going to start off by identifying why individual differences are important for organizational behavior. And we'll talk about sort of why organizations should care about measuring individual differences and the ways that who you are as a person and an employee matter for all of those key job outcomes that we've talked about. Then we're going to spend a lot of time talking about personality. Personality is one of the key individual differences that we care about and that we spend a lot of time thinking about. And we're going to focus in on some different ways to measure and assess personality, because there are some important controversies surrounding that. And then we'll also talk more about abilities. So we'll talk about things like cognitive ability, but some other abilities as well as controversies surrounding those. So we're really going to dig into kind of the wide range of individual differences and the problems that arise when we try to measure each of them. So as I've just mentioned, I want to start off by presenting a case that individual differences matter. And I want you to do some reflection on your own to think about why we should care about the traits that someone brings to the table when thinking about organizational behavior before we proceed. So I'll give you a second to kind of pause and do that. But really, the most salient reason is probably that certain traits are better for performance or better allow people to engage in relevant behaviors on the job, right? But we also care about individual differences because we care about fit. Meaning we care about matching the right person to the right job. And here we're drawing on what's called the interactionist perspective. This theory broadly states that employees' behavior isn't just determined by their traits or characteristics alone, but rather that their behavior is determined simultaneously or in tandem by the interaction between the organizational environment and the employee's traits. We used an example previously about extroversion. Right? We noted that extroversion is generally positively related to job performance when we talked about job behaviors last week, though as we'll talk about this week, the relationship tends to be pretty modest. But does that mean that we should always hire extroverts for every job? The answer here is no, right? If we think about the case of a librarian, that probably helps illustrate that although extroversion is broadly related to job performance, it might not be the right fit for every single job, right? If we think about a librarian, an extrovert might be absolutely miserable in a job that dictates that they can't talk to people and that they have to be quiet all the time. And because of that, they may not perform as well, or they may not stick around because they don't fit. So fit, this idea of fit, is really the key behind the interactionist perspective. And here we generally believe that high fit is better than low fit, meaning that employees will thrive when their individual differences are well matched to the characteristics of the organization or of the specific job. We refer to each of these different forms of fit as person-organization fit, how well the person and the organization's values and principles and mission fit together. And then person-job fit, which is much more about sort of how the skills and abilities and other characteristics like your personality traits that you bring to the table are demanded by that job, right? We're thinking about how qualified the person is for performing those specific tasks, but also how much they might enjoy the tasks of the job. Now, data certainly show that employees do indeed thrive when they have higher fit. They're more satisfied, they're more committed, they perform better, they get along with people better, and so on, right? Basically, this is related to every positive outcome we can think of when they have high fit. So that means that we need to really care about the individual differences that people bring to the table. And as we'll talk about throughout our time together this week, we need to care about how we can accurately measure and capture those individual differences. So our goal for much of the rest of our time is just to think about all of the meaningful ways that people vary. And first, I think we need to start by identifying exactly what we mean when we say individual differences. Individual differences can be defined as psychological differences between people. These are basically all of the things that make people different from one another or make people who they are. Individual differences are extremely important in choosing among job applicants. So in most cases, all applicants are not created equal, and there are going to be applicants who would be better at particular jobs than others, or at least a better fit for particular jobs than others. We study and measure individual differences to figure out exactly who those people are. Now, one of the assumptions behind individual differences is that they tend to be stable over the lifespan. What I mean by that is if you're relatively high in extroversion now, we assume, and the data show, that you'll probably be relatively high in extroversion a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 2 decades from now, because these are enduring, at least in the adult lifespan. Now, thinking about our field and what kinds of individual differences we're most interested in, we tend to be interested in what we call KSAOs. You'll probably hear that acronym a lot throughout your coursework. And that stands for knowledge, skills, abilities, and other attributes. Today, we're primarily going to focus in on abilities and this other bucket. So in other, that's where we put personality, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about personality and ability. But to really sort of briefly talk through these, knowledge is your collection of knowledge that's usually gained through education or training of some kind. And knowledge of these is the easiest to change, right? Hopefully every day that you walk away from this class, your knowledge has changed. You've gained some new facts through education. Then we have skills. Skills are some sort of practice act, like a technical skill or people skills. And skills are harder to train as compared to knowledge, because knowledge, it's really just about exposure and retention. Skill, it's about learning how to do something. So you need the relevant knowledge to be able to perform the skill, but you need some other processes as well. So skills are trainable, but not as trainable as knowledge. And then we get into abilities, which are thought to be, again, very stable over the lifespan. So we think that your cognitive ability is kind of set by at least adolescence. And we also think about your personality as being pretty firm around that same time. So we're going to focus in on those two things because they aren't as changeable as the others. Then As I said, we're going to really jump into personality because this is something that has received a lot of attention in the organizational sciences, but that has also sort of captured the public's imagination recently. There's so much online content right now about what it means to have certain personality traits or constellations of personality traits, and there are more and more ways of categorizing personality all of the time. And I'm sure you've seen some of these online, like the Myers-Briggs or Enneagrams or something like that, and you may have even done a test to figure out exactly who you are or what your personality profile means. So I think that makes it even more important to understand what personality really is, how we understand it in an academic context, and then how we assess it in organizations to kind of separate the science from the pseudoscience right now. Now, unfortunately, there's really no agreed upon definition of personality, but the definition that we're going to stick with, because I think it's a pretty strong definition and as close as agreed upon as we can get, is a person's characteristic way of thinking, feeling, and behaving that generalizes across a wide variety of situations. Now, to give you a little bit of history here, there was actually a period of time where people didn't think that personality existed, and they thought that behavior was completely determined by the environment. If so, this would fundamentally change the way that we practice organizational behavior, because it would say that we don't need to care about who we hire. As long as we create the right organizational environment, people will behave exactly the way that we want them to. And this led researchers down a really weird path for some time, again, where they thought that people had absolutely no personality. But people have since realized that people do engage in pretty consistent behaviors across situations, and that we all have these behavioral tendencies that are pretty stable. There are, of course, what we would call strong situations that limit the expression of personality, right? Those definitely exist. For example, if you're in a library, it's pretty hard to tell if someone's extroverted or introverted based on their behavior because the situational demand is so strong, right? In a library, everyone is supposed to be quiet. So personality doesn't have to be displayed in every single context, but the idea is that you would behave that way in most contexts, that extroverts and introverts will behave differently across most situations. So people who enjoy talking in class are also probably more sociable at parties, and they're more likely to hang out with a group of friends on the weekends and so forth, right? They generally enjoy socializing in various contexts. So that's what I mean by generalizing across situations. And it's those generalizable tendencies that we want to pick up on when measuring and assessing personality. So we've done a ton of work on personality, and a lot of this work has been sort of centered on how we classify personality, right? We really need to understand all of the different aspects of human personality that can differentiate me from someone else and that person from everyone else and so forth. So we've created a model, and there are several models, but the most influential of those models is what we call the Big Five model of personality. And to again give you just a touch of history here, the way that this model was created is that people started with what we call the lexical hypothesis, or the idea that we can basically examine human language to determine all of the ways that we describe personality or the traits that people have. So the idea is that if it's a way we can characterize people or differentiate them from each other, we have words to talk about those traits. Now, working from that theory, a couple of scientists actually set out to classify human personality by applying this lexical hypothesis and searching through the entire dictionary and identifying every single term that can be thought of as a characteristic of a person. Now, as you can imagine, they identified a very large number of words. They actually identified over 18,000 words to start with. But then what they did is they started paring them down by grouping words together that basically meant the same thing. And eventually, through a very long process, that 8,000 word list was reduced to 5 meaningful components of personality, and those are the 5 traits that are captured in the Big Five. Research is very supportive of this particular model and shows that this best captures sort of the range of facets that fall into human personality. Now, those 5 factors are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And some people like to remember this through the acronym OCEAN, which is why I've ordered them in this way. Maybe that will help you recall what the Big Five are. You can also make canoe out of this if you like canoe better. But we're going to talk through what each of these means on the next slide. All right, so we're going to go with the canoe acronym here in case that is received better for you and helps you remember a little bit more. So we're going to start with conscientiousness, and I'm sure this is a word that we're all familiar with. We use this pretty often in regular language to talk about different people. And broadly speaking, someone who's conscientious is someone who's dependable, they're organized, they're detail-oriented, they're the people you can rely on to meet deadlines, show up when they say they're going to show up, and etc. Someone who's conscientious is not careless, they're not irresponsible. Then for agreeableness, these are often thought of as people who sort of go with the flow. They don't really want to rock the boat, and they're the kinds of people that just kind of say yes or go along to get along. But we can also think of agreeable people as being kind, being cooperative. They tend to be really sympathetic or empathetic to other people. They tend to be helpful, they're warm, and they're not the people who seek out conflict or feel particularly comfortable disagreeing with other folks. Then we have neuroticism, and the other end of neuroticism is emotional stability. And again, a word we use a lot, so I'm sure we can all think of someone who's neurotic or who we could describe as being neurotic. And those folks tend to be pretty moody. They tend to experience a lot of negative affect. They are sort of really reactive to stressful situations. They're nervous all the time, maybe catastrophize and always think of the worst case scenario and so on. If we think about the other pole of this, emotional stability, we would consider those people to be calm, steady, relaxed, and kind of even keel across situations. Then we have openness, or the longer version of this is openness to experience. And folks who are high in openness tend to be curious, they're creative, they're intelligent, they seek out new types of experiences and new ideas. They sort of hear out different perspectives rather than being closed off to them. And then we have extroversion, and of course the opposite of extroversion is introversion. And extroversion is really all about where you get your energy from. And for extroverts, they tend to get their energy from social interactions, whereas introverts tend to have their energy depleted by social interactions and restored by being alone. So one way that I tell people to sort of ask themselves if they're introverted or extroverted is to imagine that they're at a party, they're having a great time, they're happy that they came to the party. What do they want to do next? If the answer is, I want to go to another party, I want to keep having fun, you're probably an extrovert. If the answer is, I've had so much fun at this party and now I need to go home and sit in a dark room by myself for the next 5 hours, you're probably an introvert, right? You're an extrovert if you gain energy from social interaction, and an introvert if you lose energy from social interaction. Okay, so now that we know what these Big Five are and what each of these traits means, I want to spend a little bit of time assessing. And there are 2 sort of goals here. So I'm going to show you what a typical personality test looks like. And the first goal is I want you to learn a little bit about yourself and where you fall on these Big Five characteristics. And then the second goal is I want you to see what this looks like, because this is kind of akin to how organizations would measure and assess personality before we hire folks or when putting folks onto teams or things like that. And there are, again, some controversies and some limitations with these measures. And I think seeing them firsthand really helps highlight those issues. All right, so here's what that personality test looks like. I've tried to squish it over to the other side of the screen so my face isn't blocking all of these adjectives. And again, this is sort of a common personality test that's used in organizations and used in research and all sorts of other things. And what I'd like you to do is take as long as you need, go ahead and pause on this slide, and I want you to just rate each of these different adjectives or descriptors here on the scale that's noted above. So 1 would be this is extremely inaccurate of you. You don't describe yourself in that way at all. And 9 would be this is extremely accurate of you, meaning you think that this is something that is very characteristic of who you are. So again, take the time that you need, go through each of these adjectives and give them a rating from 1 to 9. Then hopefully after you've done that, you might want to create some scale scores or figure out exactly where you fall on extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness. So what I've done here is list all of the adjectives from that former list in terms of the overarching personality facet that it's intended to measure. So what I want you to do is tally up your scores for each of the big 5. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your score for talkative, for extroverted, bold, energetic, shy, quiet, bashful, withdrawn, and sum those, and then do the same thing for each of the other 4 facets. Now, before you do that, there is one thing that you need to do. For all of the facets that have, or the adjectives that have a negative sign next to them, you need to reverse score them. What I mean by that is shy indicates the opposite of extroversion, so you have to reverse your score. So if it got a 9 before, it gets a 1 now. If it got an 8 before, it gets a 2 now, and so on. Another way that you can think about it is just take 10 and subtract your original score, right? So if you take 10, subtract 9, that will give you a 1. So take a second to reverse score those items and then tally those up. Hopefully you've had a chance to do that. And here, it's really just about higher scores indicating that you're more extroverted. So you can think about sort of where you score as compared to the highest possible score that you could have. There isn't sort of a threshold of if you score above a 35, then you're an extrovert, and if you score below that, you're an introvert, because that's not how personality works, right? It's not that there are 2 poles to each personality construct and you fall into one or the other. It really is this continuum. Okay, so hopefully you now know a little bit about where you score in personality. And I'm also going to come back to this measure because, as I said, there's some measurement issues, there's some controversies with personality, and I want to really dissect how good of an assessment that was and maybe some issues that might be already apparent to you with measuring personality in this way. But before we do that, I want to get into this question of how predictive personality is of job performance, right? Again, our purpose as organizational behavior scholars or practitioners is that we want to understand and improve job performance, job attitudes, these outcomes that we care about. So in order to improve job performance, we need to select people that have the right individual differences. And that means we need to understand if personality is one of the sets of individual differences that we should be selecting on. So here I've presented meta-analytic correlations. Again, a meta-analysis is going to go out and look at absolutely every study that's ever been done, looking at Big 5 and how it relates to job performance. And also to remind you what a correlation tells us, it tells us 2 things, right? It tells us the magnitude of a relationship or the strength of a relationship, and it also tells us direction. The closer to 1 a correlation is, the stronger it is. So if we look sort of down the list here, we'll see that the relationships between personality and job performance are actually quite small, right? And that tells us that personality is not that predictive of job performance overall, and certainly not as predictive as we tend to think about it or talk about it in our conventional wisdom. And in fact, our strongest correlation here is between conscientiousness and job performance, and that's at 0.16. So again, nothing to sort of write home about because this is pretty weak. And then if we look at the middle ones like openness, we basically have no relationship. Extroversion is only 0.07, agreeableness only 0.08. So almost pretty close to a zero relationship here. Now, there are lots of reasons that this could be true, that we see that personality isn't related to overall job performance very strongly. And one of the main sort of criticisms that people have here is that this could be because some personality traits are more strongly related to some jobs than others. And some traits might even be good for some jobs or in some cases, but bad for others. So to give you an example, agreeableness could be a good thing, right? In customer service, where you kind of have to say yes to the customer and just sort of bend to the customer's will, having a really agreeable person is probably the right thing. However, there are also times when it might not be as desirable to be agreeable. So if we have a CEO or somebody who's really high in the sort of chain of command, we want somebody who's going to be really strong, right? And not sort of acquiesce to other people. So high agreeableness might not be a good thing. So it's possible that we're sort of failing to capture how predictive these different personality traits could be for specific jobs, because they're simply not generalizable across lots of different jobs. Then the other big issue with personality is that there are limitations of the measurement that make it really difficult to truly capture personality in its true form within potential employees or within employees. And obviously, if you go back a couple slides and you look at those different adjectives that I presented to you that are part of a really common personality measure, it's probably pretty easy to look at the questions and know what a good response is and know what a bad response is, right? It's pretty obvious that an employer wants you to say that you're intelligent. And if they ask you something about, like being sloppy or not detail oriented, it's pretty obvious that you should say no and not admit that, even if you know that that's true of yourself. So we call this issue social desirability, right? People want to present themselves in a way that makes them look good. And essentially what social desirability is faking. You're faking the test to make it seem like you're more conscientious or more emotionally stable or more open to experience than you actually are, because you think that that's what the organization wants, right? There are real stakes on the line. Whether you get a job or not depends on these personality scores. So people are pretty motivated to fake and present themselves in a more positive way. Now, wanting to be viewed positively might not be the only reason that people fake personality tests. And it's possible that people might also genuinely be unaware of their personality traits, right? People are not always great at recognizing their flaws. So it's possible that some people may truly believe that they're more conscientious or less neurotic, for example, than they actually are, and report themselves in that way on these personality tests. Now, some people debate the degree to which faking is truly an issue. On one hand, employees are misrepresenting themselves to organizations, and that makes it hard for organizations to make an informed selection decision, right? They think that you have a different personality profile than you actually do. They're going to hire you thinking you're one person, and you might show up as somebody completely different. On the other hand, though, some people argue that knowing what traits are required in a situation or what traits are most desirable on the job is actually a good thing, right? Employees who can recognize that being, say, extroverted is the right thing for a particular situation are probably more likely to change their behavior and act more extroverted in those situations. So some people argue it's actually a good thing to have this social desirability because it shows that an employee is aware of what it takes to be good at the job. Obviously, the limitation there would be if they can't actually do it, right? So it's one thing to say that they're extroverted and recognize that extroversion is needed in a particular scenario. But if you're not able to show up and actually fake your personality in a real interaction and appear more extroverted than you actually are, then that really doesn't carry any benefit. So because of these issues with that sort of traditional paper and pencil personality test that I showed you and had you assess yourselves on, organizations have been trying to come up with alternatives, right? Maybe there's a different way we can get at personality that isn't as obvious or doesn't align with faking or isn't as easily faked as this traditional test. So organizations have been assessing what we call integrity, or creating these integrity tests. And it's very much related to personality, but is trying to get at personality in a different way. So integrity tests really assess a combination of personality traits, and the personality traits that tend to be more highly related to performance than other traits. So if you score high on an integrity test, that reflects high conscientiousness, low neuroticism, and high agreeableness. Obviously, having integrity or being an honest, ethical employee is also kind of broadly valuable to organizations because they want people who aren't going to engage in bad behavior towards other people, engage in bad behavior towards the organization, or otherwise do unethical things that could hurt the reputation or performance of the organization. So these integrity tests have been found to be predictive of job performance and are actually more predictive of job performance than these individual personality traits on their own. And they also predict counterproductive work behavior, which is kind of unsurprising. When people have more integrity, they're more honest, they're less likely to engage in these bad behaviors. But we still have this question of whether they actually are sort of easier or more difficult to fake. So I want to show you an example of what an integrity test looks like so that we can figure out if we think this is less clear to employees what the right kind of answer is. Here we have two different kinds of integrity tests, what we call clear purpose integrity tests and then a veiled purpose integrity test. And the idea is that the clear purpose integrity test is kind of, you can take it at face value. They're going to ask you exactly what they want to know. And the idea behind the veiled purpose is that they're getting at integrity without asking as directly. An example item from a clear purpose test is, did you ever think about taking money from where you worked but didn't go through with it? And then an example item from a veiled purpose integrity test is, I've never hurt anyone's feelings. Now, I think we can probably all agree that this is still fakeable, right? In the same way that you don't want to tell your organization that you're sloppy and disorganized, you probably also don't want to tell your organization that you think about stealing money from work, right? I think that these are pretty clear. And some of them, they try to sort of change the referent and say, do you think in general employees think about stealing money from work as a way to get at how you actually think, but maybe you wouldn't admit that you would think. But those have problems too, because you may think that other people would do behaviors that you wouldn't personally do. So integrity tests are more predictive of job performance, but certainly faking is still a concern. I think we can all kind of go down the line here and figure out what the right answer is. Whew, okay, so we have to talk about the Myers-Briggs. It feels like kind of the elephant in the room when talking about personality, because this is a really popular way of assessing personality, and it's something that is sort of all over the internet, and you may have taken the MBTI or the Myers-Briggs type indicator, and you may know exactly who you are on the MBTI, but we want to sort of think about it scientifically, right? Think about what the actual evidence says. Now, the Myers-Briggs was created based on the Big Five model, but as we just talked about, a Big Five inventory typically just tells you the degree to which you're extroverted or the degree to which you're conscientious. It doesn't classify you as being extroverted or not. The MBTI does do that, right? It classifies people into different personality types and treats this as if you have to be one or the other, right? You can't sort of meet in the middle, or you can't sort of be a blend of two different things. Now, there are 4 different categories that are, again, each bipolar. So if we look at our first category, which is extroversion, introversion, it's going to tell you that you are an E or an I. And then for sensing versus intuition, it's going to tell you that you are either S or N, and so on, right? And that results in 16 different personality types. If you're interested in what your personality type is, you can easily take these tests online if you're curious about it. However, I would maybe caution against taking this sort of on board too deeply, because although the MBTI is very popular, and there are actually tons of firms that use this test, and in fact, more than 80 of the Fortune 100 companies used the MBTI for some kind of purpose within their firms, it's actually really important to recognize that this was not created for and is not validated for the purpose of selecting employees. What I mean by that is that you should not use the MBTI for hiring purposes, and the company who produces the MBTI specifically prohibits that usage of the Myers-Briggs. That being said, people definitely do this, right? Or they use some version of it. A lot of personality measures that are used in organizations aren't explicitly the MBTI, but they're based in the MBTI. And that can leave the organization really vulnerable to legal issues. I'm not here to say that the Myers-Briggs has absolutely no benefit for organizations or for individual employees or people to understand more about themselves, but it's probably better used for kind of understanding people, how they best communicate, their relative strengths of different people and how they may work together in a team, but it shouldn't be used for decisions. So in other words, we can use this for something like learning, we can use this for something like development, but we should not be deciding who to hire or who to promote into positions based on the Myers-Briggs. All right, so now that we've talked about the Big Five and we've talked about personality, we're gonna transition into thinking about what we might have missed, right? We sort of have introduced what personality is. It's all of these enduring characteristics that can help differentiate me from anyone else. And so far, we only have these 5 different traits that we're using to capture all of adult human personality and all of its complexity. And realistically, there might be some other facet of personality that's kind of slipping through the cracks here, or some other ways that people differ that are still important for how they show up in organizations. Our first additional personality trait is what we call locus of control. And locus of control really reflects whether people believe that events in their lives are caused by luck, chance, or fate, or if they're controlled by their own actions. And here you can have an internal locus of control or an external locus of control. An internal locus of control means that you believe that your outcomes in life are directly tied to your behavior. If I go to work and I do X, that might get me a promotion, right? I see the linkage between what I do at work and the outcomes that I receive. External locus of control means that you sort of view the outcomes that happen to you, the things that result in life, as being luck or chance or fate. You don't see a clear connection between what you do and the outcomes that you receive. It's probably pretty obvious here that from a performance standpoint, we want people with an internal locus of control. We want people who understand that the way that they behave at work and the choices that they make are clearly related to outcomes, like whether they're getting promotions, their performance level, the way they interact with other people and how other people interact with them, and so on. If we have this external locus of control, it's really hard to get people to engage in the behaviors that we want them to engage in because they don't see how that's going to produce the intended outcome. Then we also have what we call the dark triad. And this is another model that tries to capture personality. And it's kind of specifically in response to the Big Five. The Big Five really thinks about maybe the more positive or normative aspects of personality. And what the dark triad tries to do is fill the gaps and talk about maybe the less savory parts of personality. And we do know that obviously some people have these darker tendencies or these darker traits. So people have tried to formalize ways that we can capture what those might be. In the dark triad, we have 3 personality traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Narcissism really refers to having an inflated view of the self and a desire for self-love to be reinforced by others. Folks who are high on narcissism tend to think that they're fantastic. They want to hang around other people that reinforce these beliefs, and they're not very good at being accountable or sort of taking accountability for their mistakes. They'll instead kind of scapegoat them and say someone else is responsible for bad things that happen, but they'll take credit for all of their successes. Machiavellianism is obviously named after Niccolo Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince, which was all about how to manipulate other people to get what you want. So people high on this trait are manipulative, they see people as a means to an end, and they tend to be very cynical of human nature. So they view people as being fundamentally selfish and uncompromising, and advocate that you should be that way too, because that's how everyone else is. Then we have psychopathy, and this is really about having a lack of concern for others, being very impulsive and not being able to control those impulses, and having a lack of remorse when you do bad things or hurt people. And so some people might not recognize that they hurt other people, but even when they do recognize it, they don't feel particularly bad about it. And I want to be clear that we're not talking about clinical levels of psychopathy, so we're not talking about people who would be diagnosed as psychopaths, but people who demonstrate some of the related traits. Now, I've also pulled together meta-analytic correlations here, and as you can see, the dark triad are not really more strongly related to personality as compared to the Big Five. Our correlations here are -0.03, -0.07, and -0.1. So we have some relationship here with performance, as you probably could have predicted. These relationships are negative, meaning people who score higher on these traits have lower performance at work, but still nothing that surpasses the size of the correlation that we saw for the Big Five traits. All right, I think we have officially said everything that we can say about personality today, so we're going to shift gears, leave personality behind, and transition into talking about our other individual differences. And really, we're going to focus in on some abilities that matter a lot. As I mentioned, cognitive ability and personality are kind of the 2 individual differences that we care about the absolute most in our field, and we'll talk about why this week and later on. And we've already sort of prefaced that with the job behaviors lecture, but we're going to sort of keep plodding forward and talk about abilities here. All right, so starting with cognitive ability, this is, again, kind of a tricky construct to define. And oftentimes we'll see cognitive ability defined as the capacity to reason, plan, and solve problems. But in defining this as a capacity, it really emphasizes the heritability of cognitive ability and makes it seem like kind of at birth, cognitive ability is set. And although abilities are largely thought to be sort of untrainable, we do know that there's some flexibility in cognitive ability. It isn't just sort of determined at birth and there's nothing you can do about it. And things like how you invest in education and nutrition early on in life really matter, right? So abilities can be developed to some degree, even though they're pretty stable, and most of that development happens really early in life. So perhaps a better definition that reflects this and shows that there's part of it that's genetic, but it's not only genetic, is that cognitive ability is our repertoire of acquired skills, knowledge, learning sets, and generalization tendencies that's available at any one period of time. Now, I know that that may not be quite as clear, but it really is about how much ability we have to do things like solve problems, solve them quickly, reason through things like math concepts or verbal concepts, etc. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what cognitive ability means and the types of abilities that fall underneath this umbrella. So when we're talking about cognitive ability, we're really talking about a group of different specific abilities, but research shows that they kind of coalesce together. And what I mean by that is people tend to be high in certain abilities, and that means that they're also more likely to be high in other abilities. In other words, there are high, strong, positive correlations among the different facets of cognitive ability. And because of this, we really tend to just measure people's overall cognitive ability instead of measuring each specific type, unless there's a certain reason why a specific ability might be important for a particular job. We call this general factor or general level of cognitive ability G, which just stands for general mental ability. Sometimes people call it GMA, which you might see written down or in your textbook or something like that. But I want to be clear here that when we talk about G, GMA, or cognitive ability, we're talking about the same construct. Now, one way we can think about this is being sort of like athleticism. There are people who have a general aptitude for sports, right? And we expect that when they're good at some sports, they're going to be good at others because they're just good athletes. Or another example is creativity. Some people are just good at all creative activities, right? They might be good at lots of different art mediums, or they might be good at writing and art and other things that are creative. Now, all of that does not mean that there aren't primary abilities that are important. As I said, for specific jobs, there might be certain types of ability, like spatial ability, that become particularly important. But broadly speaking, in the workplace, we tend to just measure cognitive ability as a global construct. And that's certainly reflected in the way that you've probably had your cognitive ability measured in the past if you've ever taken an IQ test, right? It's sort of comprised of items that test lots of different abilities, but you just get one score. Now, just like with personality, I want to sort of show you what measuring cognitive ability looks like. And this is a measured test. I'm going to pull up a timer here. Okay, so our most common measure is what we call the Wonderlic, and this is a speeded test, so it's intended to be both difficult and timed so that you have to think through these different questions really quickly. And by really quickly, I mean really quickly, because you have to finish 50 questions in 12 total minutes. Now, a score of 20 is equivalent to an IQ of 100, which is average, and a score of 10 indicates literacy. So you have to get 20 out of the 50 questions to be average, and anything above 20 would be above average. So get ready. I'm going to show you what some of these questions look like. I'm just going to give you a snippet, but I am going to time you, and I'm going to advance the slides in time with how much time you would actually get if you were taking this test, to give you an idea of maybe the stress or pressure of trying to take a test like this. All right, go ahead and get started. I've started the timer. I'm giving you slightly longer than you would actually have, but I'm going to give you 6 questions on this screen and 4 questions on the next. All right, you have a little less than a minute left. All right, and we are at time. All right, so that was probably a little stressful, and that was only 10 questions. So imagine having to do 50 total questions in about that same pace. It certainly doesn't leave a lot of time to even read the question or carefully consider it, let alone do some math if you have to and get to the final answer. So I wanted to, again, present this to you so you understand the experience of taking this type of cognitive ability test and the pressure that people might be under when they're taking this very quick, very speeded test. So to give you an idea of sort of what types of scores different jobs are looking for, I put together a table here that shows the minimum score that you need for different types of positions. And that ranges from scoring a 30 out of 50 to be a mechanical engineer, all the way down to scoring a 16 out of 50 to be something like a maid. Okay, so out of everything that we study in our field, cognitive ability really is the best predictor of job performance. It outperforms basically everything else, and it certainly far outperforms personality tests, right? If you remember, those correlations were certainly not high. The highest was 0.16 for conscientiousness. And if we compare that to the meta-analytic estimate for the relationship between cognitive ability and job performance, that's 0.51. So that's pretty high, and it's basically the highest correlation that I'm going to show you throughout this entire semester, right? So we do know that cognitive ability is very predictive of job performance. There are some caveats to that, though, that I think are really important to keep in mind. The first caveat is that more basic jobs have a weaker relationship between cognitive ability and job performance. And we see that cognitive ability really matters for complex jobs, on the other hand, which obviously makes sense. But this doesn't necessarily mean that we need to measure cognitive ability for every single job out there, or that it's going to help us really identify who's going to be the best person for every kind of job. And then there's also a lot of controversy surrounding the use of cognitive ability, and in particular in the process of selecting employees for a particular job. And we're going to dig into that controversy on the next slide. So the reason why cognitive ability is so controversial is because there's a consistent race gap in cognitive ability scores. And I want to be really clear here about what I mean when I say that. That's not necessarily to say that there are differences in true cognitive ability amongst people of different races. But what I mean is that people score differently on cognitive ability tests. And most of this controversy comes from that exact point, is trying to figure out if these differences in cognitive ability test scores are real or if they're a product of the test. And to give you an idea of how big these racial differences are, there's about a 10 to 15 point gap in IQ test scores amongst employees of different races. So if we compare, say, Black test takers to white test takers, we see that Black test takers will score about 10 points lower than white test takers. Now, there are some reasons to think that there could be true differences in cognitive ability. And one primary reason would be related to income, right? A lot of the things associated with cognitive ability are linked to income, right? Like the quality of schools that people have access to in younger ages, the level of nutrition people get when they're younger, the amount of learning materials present in the home when developing, and all of those sorts of things. And we certainly know that in the United States, at least, race and income are unfortunately very related. But in our field, we're particularly interested in how the test is functioning for different people. And really what we want to know is if differences in scores are a product of a faulty test, because if so, that leaves organizations who use that test open to lawsuits. Some issues that we might see with the content of cognitive ability tests is that they tend to use scenarios or phrases or other kinds of material that really resonate more for white upper and middle class test takers as compared to anyone else. And then to make things worse, a lot of tests are validated using largely white samples, right? So we're assessing the accuracy of whether this test actually measures cognitive ability with primarily white test takers, which doesn't answer the question of whether it accurately measures cognitive ability for other people. So that validation is really the process of showing that cognitive ability tests are accurate. And if we only use those white samples, we really can't conclude that accuracy holds for everybody. So I'm not here to say that you shouldn't use cognitive ability tests, but that they are legally tricky, and that at a minimum, these should be designed with extreme caution to ensure that they're testing cognitive ability and nothing else. No cultural knowledge, no exposure to certain things, and that they don't create bias in the test scores. Then another issue that could be contributing to race differences in cognitive ability testing is what we call stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is this very specific kind of anxiety or worry that people feel when they're in a situation where they might confirm a negative stereotype about their group. We know that people from racially minoritized backgrounds are often judged as if they represent their entire group. So when they're in situations where they know there's a negative stereotype about their group, like a stereotype about competence, it creates this pressure to not confirm that stereotype, because if they do confirm it, then people will think the stereotype is true of everyone belonging to that group and not just sort of a trait of that individual person. Now, of course, one area where we have lots of different stereotypes is with cognitive performance, or about competency broadly. We stereotype people of Asian descent as being particularly high at cognitive performance, and we stereotype people who are Latinx or African American or Black as being lower in cognitive ability as compared to white folks. We also have some gendered expectations about who's particularly good at specific fields in particular. So we definitely have some stereotypes about women in STEM and thinking that women are not as good at STEM-related competencies. So what we see is that in these contexts where these different stereotypes are particularly salient, where people are very aware of them, it can actually hurt performance. And the reason why is because it induces stress. That stress is cognitively distracting, and that makes it harder to perform well on the test. Then, of course, stereotype threat can also hurt people in a selection context. So if people know that they're applying for a job, getting that job is a relatively high stakes outcome, and they know that people have negative stereotypes about their group, they're probably going to experience that stereotype threat. And research has shown that this actually does happen. And when applicants experience stereotype threat, it hurts their performance on selection measures. But most importantly, it artificially deflates their measures. So they're going to look like a worse applicant than they actually are, simply because they have this specific anxiety. Okay, shifting away from cognitive ability and all of its many controversies, I want to conclude by talking about one last type of ability, which is emotional intelligence. And even though emotional intelligence has the word intelligence in it, no one is really sure if this acts like a cognitive ability, or if it's more of a personality trait, or if it's more of a skill. And the answer is it's probably somewhere in the middle of all of those things, but that's kind of why I've saved it to the end of the lecture, because it does have cognitive ability overlap, but it's not purely an ability. Now, emotional intelligence is what we associate with people skills. So this is being able to recognize emotions in other people, and then also being aware of the emotions that you personally experience and being able to manage those emotions. Research has shown that emotional intelligence does predict job performance, although not quite as much as cognitive ability. And in addition to job performance, it's also related to things like leadership behaviors, but again, those relationships are relatively low. But it does have a pretty substantial relationship with well-being on the job, in that people who are more emotionally intelligent tend to sort of thrive on the job a little bit better. Now, even though emotional intelligence seems like something that would really matter, particularly for customer-based jobs or maybe healthcare-based jobs, we just really don't see that it predicts all that well. And one reason could be a measurement issue like what we see with personality. It's pretty hard to measure emotional intelligence in general, and most people aren't necessarily good judges of whether they're high in emotional intelligence or not. All right, so digging a little bit deeper into what emotional intelligence actually is, there are 4 recognized components of emotional intelligence, and generally people who are high in some of these components tend to be higher in all of them. The first component is self-awareness. This is really about your ability to understand the emotions that you're experiencing and then being able to express them accurately to others. So this is about having a lot of insight into your own emotions, being able to regulate them appropriately, and being able to express them in ways that are accurate and also healthy. Then we also have other awareness, which is similar, but it's about other people's emotions. So this is really our ability to recognize what other people are feeling. If you have a friend who can kind of immediately tell that something's off in your mood because you're speaking a little bit differently or your body language is a little bit different, then they're probably high on this facet, other awareness of emotional intelligence. Then we have emotion regulation, which is really about your ability to recover from emotional experiences and control your emotions. People who are high in emotion regulation tend to be able to not let a particular bad event or feeling a particular negative emotion derail their entire day or their entire week, and they tend to rebound back to positive emotions much quicker. And then finally, the 4th component and final component is use of emotions. And this is your ability to harness emotions and use them to improve your success or other people's success. So if you're able to, say, focus in on times you felt really proud and really accomplished at work to help motivate you to get through another big performance episode, that would be a good display of use of emotions. Now, again, it sounds sort of on the surface of it that emotional intelligence should be strongly related to job performance. It certainly is related to job performance, but that relationship isn't particularly high. It's certainly not going to beat cognitive ability as a predictor of job performance. And the degree to which it predicts performance really depends on the kind of job that someone is in.